Good evening, and welcome to League of Women Voters Presents. I'm Jim Robertson, and our topic tonight is the Initiative Petitions. My guests are on my far right, Ryan Hobart. He's Communications Director with the Missouri Secretary of State's office. Thanks for coming, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
25th District State Representative Chris Kelly, Democrat of Columbia, and Marvin Overby, who is Professor of Political Science at MU. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Ryan, will you start us out explaining a little bit about the initiative petition process? And I
Sure.
heard you say earlier there were over 100 applications for initiatives.
Yeah, right now, this year, there's a whole process that has to happen before. They take them to the streets, go to Home Depot or the library and start gathering signatures. And just submitted in that initial phase, there have been over 140 currently. And if you go back almost 10 years to 2004, there was only 16 submitted in that initial phase, so it's grown immensely over that time. But
will there still be more submitted potentially?
Yeah, I mean, we are still approving them for them to go out and circulate for signatures. Obviously, the time frame is a big hurdle for them because they have to collect, over 100,000 signatures or over 200,000 signatures, depending on whether they're trying to get it as a statutory change, just the state law, or to the state constitution. So the time frame is hard for them to kind of meet in a short window of time because they have to have them in by May 6th, but there's still petitions coming in almost weekly, daily sometimes. So it's a process that people have begun to use a whole lot more, and they submit a whole lot more versions of each petition. They might submit over a dozen versions and only circulate just one in the end, but they want to have a wide variety of options to choose from, it seems like, especially lately, especially over the last few election cycles.
Are there differences in each of the versions for the most part? Or?
Usually there are. Sometimes they might be subtle differences, sometimes they might be large differences, but yeah, usually the intent is to have, they're working for a group or somebody else who wants to have options with how they're going to change the state law, or the state constitution. So they have multiple versions to choose from, and usually, since it's such a time-intensive process and requires so many resources, they choose just one to go out and circulate, just in terms of being able to focus on that.
And how many of those will ultimately end up as ballot issues in November?
Like I said, the number initially submitted has grown immensely. But usually in the end, only 2 or 3 end up making it on the ballot. You might see 4 or 5 issues total, but that's because the state legislature uses joint resolutions to submit things to a vote of the people. So there's a couple different ways that those can get on the ballot, but ones that are put on through the initiative process, usually it's only 2 or 3.
It seems like the process, and maybe Professor Overby can address this, the process seems to lend itself to special interests, and because you do have a small window where you go out and gather signatures, volunteers may not be able to do that as well as special interests that say have money and can pay signature gatherers.
I think that's exactly right, Jim. It's not a cheap process to get these signatures. It takes 5 to 8% of the population who voted in the last
depending on
gubernatorial election.
Statute, state law change, only 5% in 6 out of the 9 districts, right. And that's just out of the number of people who voted for governor in the last election. And then for the Constitution, it goes up to 8%. Right. There's a higher threshold.
But that's not an easy thing to do necessarily. It takes time and effort and resources to do it, especially since it's got to be done in six of the 9 congressional districts.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have essentially a statewide presence to do that. This is not something that necessarily represents, in my opinion, sort of the popular will, so much as it is the long reach of organized interest, using this as a way to get matters on the ballot.
And that is that an evolution of this process? I think Missouri is one of 24 states that have the initiative petition process. It was originally envisioned, I'm assuming, as a grassroots kind of way to.
It was. It grows up in the populist era at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. If my numbers are correct, I think of the 24 states, 17 of those states are west of the Mississippi, only 7 east of the Mississippi. This is something that grew up with sort of the populist movement, the opening up of the West, begins in South Dakota, I believe. You're going to see it in states that have a lengthy populist tradition like Wisconsin. You're going to see it in places like California. You don't see it in places that are sort of older line states. You don't see it as much, nearly as much on the East Coast.
Chris Kelly, I guess one way to look at the initiative is it's a failure of the legislature to do the will of the people.
It's the failure of the legislature to do the will of the people who are carrying the petition around. And sometimes it is a failure of the legislature to take up and deal with issues. The puppy thing last year or 2 years ago is the greatest example of all. The legislature failed for years and years and years to fix the dog law in Missouri. So, and they should have. And so then what do the people do? The people who want to change the puppy law go out and write a ballot initiative that is completely loaded for their side of the agenda, and there's none of the crucible of public debate that occurs in the legislature, which the legislature maybe deserves for not ever taking it up. Then they put it on the ballot. Both sides engage in an incredibly deceptive campaign of advertising. Then you get law which is well intended but is not well drafted, and then the legislature finally goes in and compromises it out and comes to not a bad dog law in Missouri. Now, it's a long way around the barn, but maybe we got where the legislature should have gone in the first place.
And it's prompted other initiatives to get back on the ballot this year to take that power away from the legislature.
Well, exactly, and let's talk about that a little bit. Is that I mean, it would require a supermajority to overturn an initiative in the legislatively, or to alter.
The danger with the initiative process is that there's no give and take in the drafting. One side drafts it entirely, and so there's nobody who says, oh, wait a minute, that section is weak or goes too far, and you fix it in the amendment process that occurs in a legislative debate. On the other hand, I can understand the point of view of people who say the legislature has repeatedly failed in many of these areas. Or people who are frustrated by the fact that people enacted, for instance, minimum wage. Legislature overturned it. People enacted campaign finance reform. Legislature overturned it.
They turned down concealed carry. The legislature overturned it.
People stopped conceal and carry. The legislature overturned it.
Is that the proper role of the legislature in this?
If you enact a statute, then a statute ought to be subject to amendment. I think that there ought to be some greater respect for when the people do it, even if the people don't do a good job. We very often don't do a good job.
Mm-hmm. There is a higher standard to change the Constitution by initiative.
Not much, but a little higher.
It should be even harder.
Our Constitution is in terrible shape. It's huge. It's the second biggest Constitution in America. It's full of special interest provisions. Our Constitution is something like more than 10 times bigger than the United States Constitution. And it's full of everything from animal law to Hancock Amendment to all kinds of stuff that don't belong in constitutions.
Including a female juror exemption, right?
Including that is also long been found to be unconstitutional.
When I tell my students this, they're appalled. Right?
Well, how do we clean that up? I mean, historically and in other states.
It's clearly not a problem. It's just a Missouri problem. Almost all state constitutions are like this. I refer to them as that the U.S. Constitution is a framework document, but most state constitutions are owner's manuals for running the state government. So they're just an accretion of all of this material in them. I remember trying to get a count of how many times the 1945 Missouri Constitution had been amended. I couldn't get one. Right. I mean, people have literally lost count of it. It's the amendments are in the body of the document. They're not added on to the end. It is a mess. If it makes us feel any better, we're far better off than Alabama, which has a constitution which I think is 10 times longer than ours. I mean, it is the size of almost of a small city phone book.
Is Alabama an initiative petition state?
I don't know.
I don't either. But every time somebody wants to keep the next legislature from changing it, they just put it in the Constitution. And they put all kinds of complex finance formulas in the Constitution, which by their very nature are going to have to change soon.
Right.
Well, eventually, does then a Constitution just collapse of its own weight, or?
Probably not. It sags a lot.
It sags a lot. That's a good way of putting it.
What you ought to do is have a constitutional amendment and start over like they did in 45.
Convention.
Convention. But people are afraid to do that because whoever they regard as the crazy people, they're afraid will elect the most delegates to the Constitution. Best example of that is the pro-choicers are afraid of the pro-lifers and vice versa. So that's why nobody will go to a constitutional convention to fix our badly dilapidated Constitution, because they're all afraid of the other side.
Brian, I want to come back to you.
Sure.
The process that you explained for getting approval to circulate initiative petitions. How many people in the Secretary of State's office are involved in that work?
It's not as many as you might think, but it takes up a majority of their time lately. There is, some dedicated staff, lawyers on staff who have to go through it, make sure it's drafted even initially the right way, how it's supposed to be. That's one step of the process. Another step, there's a summary drafted of what the initiative would do that can go on the petition, so people can look at that and
that can be controversial too.
And what else we've seen is that people use the provision in the law to file a lawsuit over it as a mechanism to slow it down or amend it to how they would like it written. It's another tool that these groups use, whichever side of it they're on, to manipulate the process or slow it down or change it or however they see fit to use it.
Mm-hmm. And are there lawsuits pending now on petitions?
It's become another normal part of the process. As the number submitted has gone up, the number of lawsuits has definitely gone up as well. And many times it's people on either side of an issue, or just all sorts of people filing lawsuits over them to try and have some influence over that summary statement or the fiscal impact statement that the auditor comes up with. It's just another piece of the growing swath of things people do to try and influence this.
Who actually writes the summary?
The Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State is, mandated to do that, and it's also approved by the Attorney General's office too. And then after that, there's a 10-day window for people to challenge it in the Cole County Circuit Court if they find some issue with it or think something's unfair or insufficient. That's kind of the standard, insufficient or unfair, and they can make their case to a judge and see if they come out on top.
And is there a timeline, is there a drop deadline for getting permission to circulate petitions?
There is not. There is not, but as I've said before, the sheer undertaking of gathering over 200,000 signatures sometimes if it's a constitutional amendment takes much more than like a month or 2 months most of the time.
Yeah. And do you know how many petitions are being circulated now?
It's, I mean, there's over 50 some odd that have been approved, and it's virtually impossible to tell unless you go out there and really watch who's out there circulating these to know which versions or how many they're circulating. It's kind of, once it goes out to these groups, they can pick and choose which ones they've had approved to go out and circulate.
Jim, to get back to a point earlier, of those 56 that could be circulated right now, 25 of them relate to tobacco taxes. I think there are 25 different versions.
There's been many
25
versions.
have been approved to circulate.
And there's various different groups who have submitted those, but that's definitely one we've seen multiple versions and multiple ways of addressing that
Now,
issue.
are they all working independently, or is there some?
There's two big families of tobacco tax. One is there's kind of a scam group that's really funded by the tobacco industry to put the whole thing to sleep. And that's not public, and they won't tell you who's paying for it and that kind of thing. Then there's another group by some members of the Board of Curators as individuals, not as members of the board, and some pro-science research people who want to do one where the money would be used for scientific research and higher education and health care, and that's, everybody knows who that one is and where their money's coming from. So there's 2 families just in the tobacco tax area alone, 2 families of petitions.
But if we assume that that's the case with some other big issues like the sales tax, abolishing income tax, how am I supposed to know when I walk by the post office and somebody's gathering signatures what I'm looking at?
That's a problem. That's a significant problem.
There's really no good way for a member of the public to be well informed.
And this is, I'm up on a political science professor hat for a minute. This is why the founders in the Constitution essentially did not set up an initiative or referendum process. We've never had a national one of these. And it's because they were very suspicious, as am I, of the ability of the public to exercise sound judgment on these particular matters of policy. Right? James Madison famously said that power should reside in the people, but they should not be the exercisers of it, because that's what we elect people like Representative Kelly to do. I tell my students that it's sort of a populist conceit that the people can make good judgments on these things, and I challenge them if they would rather see the crowd in Furrow Field call plays for the Tigers, or whether we want your coaching staff to do that, right? We select people to make these decisions, whether they are the coaching staff of the Tigers or the state legislature down in Jefferson City. We don't want the public making these sorts of decisions because they generally don't have the attention span, the expertise, the experience to deal with these matters, and they're going to make decisions on these things, as you say, walking into the post office, as opposed to sitting in a committee hearing room where they hear over the course of months, if not years, the details you need to know to make sound decisions on these matters.
Is there a way to fix this process? What should we be doing with the initiative petition process?
Well, maybe it should be harder to pass one. But there's no way to fix the fundamental problem that the professor is talking about, and that is the lack of the crucible. There's no pit into which the language is thrown to have the various warring sides fight about and add to and take away from, and that's how lawmaking at its best occurs. It occurs in that public pit where we work, where if I have an amendment, somebody else can explain why it's a terrible amendment or fix my amendment, and we can refine that law. And the slowness of that process, House committee, House action, Senate committee, Senate action, conference committee, or don't get it this year, has to go through the process next year. That's good that it's slow and cumbersome, because the rough edges tend to get worn off.
It's supposed to be hard.
It is supposed to be hard.
So if we accept that wisdom, we should not be in favor of making it tougher for the legislature to overturn.
That's right. On the other hand, there are some, the government ultimately does belong to the people, and if they want to do it this way, you've got to give some reasonable deference to that.
Ryan, you tried to get in here.
I was going to say, just from a pure administrative good government standpoint, the fact that people can just, 20, 30 versions of these, just throw it at a government agency who's supposed to be working on multiple different things at the same time. There's been discussion of an initial 1,000 signature threshold, like they take it out and they just gather 1,000 signatures from registered voters even to begin the process of the ballot summary being drafted or the fiscal note being drafted. So there's some minimum that they have to go through instead of just being able to walk in, submit a piece of paper or 30 pieces of paper and kind of gum up the works in that kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
It's especially bad now when you have these secretive groups, like the tobacco tax secret petition. I mean, nobody knows who's funding it. They won't tell you. And big money can buy the signatures, can write it in secret, can buy the signatures, and can fund the campaign against it without you ever knowing who's for it, who's doing it.
I would add one other point to what Representative Kelly says, that if the legislature makes a big mistake and passes a law that's unpopular, we can vote them out of office, right? What do you do if the people pass something that is unsound policy? Right? You can't go out and find other voters, right? And that's, again, going back to the analogy of coaching. If the coaches run a bad team, you fire them and bring in another set. But in a democracy, the only people you can't blame are the people themselves. And if they're the ones making these decisions, then it's very hard to overturn that policy that they put into place.
I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal balls and predict which of the initiatives being circulated now will be on the ballot in November.
First of all, one of the Rex Singfeld sales tax things will be on the ballot, I think. There's just too much money
the income tax
to keep it off. Second, I believe that the pro-university, pro-health tobacco tax will make the ballot. I don't know what else is cooking around out there.
Oh, there's plenty of things. I can't really.
I've got a list of them here.
Right. I can't really speculate on that just because I want to keep my impartial viewpoint on these, since we deal with all of them and we're part of making sure everything is done the way it should be. But
payday loans.
You can see,
two petitions to legalize cannabis.
I think
two petitions to increase the minimum wage.
It's fair. What's gaining the most attention, what you're hearing the most about on the street, are probably the initiatives that are being pushed, because people don't come up and say, "Have you heard about this? I heard about this outside of the, Boone County Library, and I want to know more about it." That's a good gauge, I think, as to what has a serious push behind it. The calls we get about petitions, that's a good gauge that they're actually being out there, they're being talked about, and they're being passed around the community, perhaps.
Are you getting calls about there are 4 petitions to decrease the size of the House? Is that gaining traction? I don't have a sense of that.
Neither do I. Honestly, I have not heard much about that, but it's obviously, since there's multiple versions of it, some group or some people have a strong feeling about that, but I don't really have a gauge on how much that's being pushed around out there.
Well, Ryan, what advice do you have, and does the Secretary of State have, for people who are, have petitions pushed in front of them every day?
And it's very easy. I think the first piece of advice I give to everyone, whether it's a reporter trying to learn more about this or somebody who just asked me because they know I work in that office, I say, if they tell you this is about a certain issue and it's something you should support, don't just take their word for it. Ask to see the petition, ask to read the summary on there at minimum, or go home and do a little bit of homework, and then you know those people are going to be there for a while and you can go back and sign it then. But it's, taking your signature off a petition requires filing some kind of paperwork with our office. So before you even get to that point, you should do your homework on it.
What about you, Chris? Any advice for people?
Yeah, do your homework. Be very careful about signing petitions, because there's unpaid loans. There's one to limit the interest rate, and there's one to prevent the interest rate from getting limited. And on tobacco tax, there's one to change it for education, and one to make it difficult to change.
Marvin?
I tell students to quote them the Federalist 10, James Madison's argument that this is what we should elect representatives to do, who have refined and enlarging views.
Tell my wife that. Refined and enlarging views.
I will call her after the show.
That's right.
There's been a non-trivial attempt to get the initiative process declared unconstitutional in the United States as a violation of what's called the Guarantee Clause. That the Constitution guarantees every state a Republican form of government. And the argument is that if you take seriously what republicanism means, little r republicanism, not big R republicanism, that it is government by elected representatives, not by direct democracy like this. So this issue raises its head every now and again as well. And I'm sympathetic to that argument, but clearly it's not one that's terribly popular in this sort of populist era.
Well, thank you. I've learned something this evening. I hope our viewers have learned something this evening. Have I left anything out? Anything you want to add to our discussion?
We hit all the the big spots, do look at them. Think carefully before you sign them, and think carefully before you vote for them, because too often people vote for or against something because it's pro-puppy is a good example,
Right.
you know, and you don't actually know if it's pro-puppy or not.
Right.
And there are plenty of examples across the country of you have an initiative on the ballot in year X that does Y, and then you have an initiative on the ballot in year X plus 2 that does not Y, right? People sort of flipping back and forth on this. Florida's seen any number of these things,
Yeah.
that where the public attitudes on these things are just not stable.
Well, I might add very selfishly that the best way for voters to stay informed is to read newspapers.
There you go.
And the Columbia Daily Tribune included, specifically. So, well, I appreciate the wisdom you all bring to this discussion. And, you know, that I think we're going to wrap it up now. If viewers should take the advice that these folks have given us and become informed before you sign any petition. Again, Ryan Hobart with the Missouri Secretary of State's office. Thank you. Chris Kelly, 25th District
24th, actually. I didn't
Sorry,
correct you before.
24th. Why did I get that wrong? And Marvin Overby, Professor of Political Science at MU. Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us tonight. League of Women Voters presents. I'm Jim Robertson. Good night.